is because many proponents of the argument from consciousness attempt to implicitly define it to mean something that it's not, such as a transcendent part of the human personality. And in doing this, they're attempting to smuggle immaterial and unnatural properties into the definition of consciousness, which is essentially a backhand way of begging the question.
Okay, stop it. Okay, yeah. So that's a big bear. I don't really, I mean, at least within the philosophy of mind, I mean, yeah, you might have some people that'll define consciousness that way, but typically there's a agreed upon definition, right? So this is the one I'm going to get into. So basically, consciousness is mental activity in and of itself. Mental activity is conscious if and only if there is anything it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. Another definition we could put forth would be this. Mental activity is conscious if there is something it feels like to have such mental activity in and of itself. The words to feel, however, is not clear enough to be used as a definition, so philosophers of mind typically define consciousness as anything it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. So that's the definition, right? Just mental activity in and of itself. Now, notice I don't include non-physical properties into that definition, right? Because it's completely neutral on whether or not consciousness is reducible or irreducible or material or immaterial. So for me, I say that consciousness is just irreducible, right? And that's different than saying that it's immaterial, right? Because I don't even know what, I don't even like the word immaterial. I don't even use that word in my language, right? Some people might, but I certainly don't. So when I talk about consciousness, I just say that it's irreducible, right? So you can't explain it in terms of things that are not conscious, right? So when you're talking about consciousness, that's the base, right? You can't really explain it in terms of anything else, right? So when we're talking about consciousness, we're just saying that that something is conscious, it's irreducible, and that's it, right? It doesn't have to include these extra properties, as he wants to, call it. And I think another thing, I'll get into this more later, but he gets a really poor explanation of consciousness, and he doesn't really do a good job of going over the alternative views of consciousness within the philosophy of mind. Even views within physicalism, because there are various views even within the physicalist camp. So even he doesn't even do a good job of going over consciousness within his own within the view that he would agree with, right? So that's another issue, but yeah.
Yeah, no, the only thing I was curious about, he talks about consciousness being the theistic definition of it is just being supernatural, or he says unnatural. And that's one of those things where the supernatural and natural distinction is kind of weird, because it's almost it seems like if we're going to grant a theistic definition of consciousness, then would you say that consciousness is then supernatural? And would that imply that maybe I don't know, the consciousness isn't even real if you want to say only the natural exists? Well, I don't know. It just seems it seems weird, saying that a theistic definition of consciousness is unnatural.
Because I would agree with him if he's going to say that consciousness is natural. I would totally agree with him on that, right? Because I don't like the definition I don't like that distinction between the natural and supernatural. I think it's meaningless, right? So I think when we're talking about consciousness, I think it's better to talk about it in terms of it being reducible or not, right? And even if you're a naturalist, I just want to emphasize, and I'll get more to this later, but even if you're a naturalist, you can say that consciousness is irreducible, right? You don't have to be a reductionist to consciousness in order to say that it's, irreducible or something. So you could actually, in a way, agree with the theistic definition. If a theistic definition just says that consciousness is irreducible, well, you could just accept that and just have a natural theory, right, that explains consciousness in terms of it being irreducible. Again, I'll get more into that later, but that's another thing I want to sort of emphasize here.